Okay. Good evening. Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to all of you who have gathered this evening for the third of 4 conversations on the theme, A Better Future for Israelis and Palestinians, affirming the sacredness of all human life. We have been most blessed by the efforts and diligence of 2 organizations that are vital to New England's social, cultural, and spiritual life. These are the Boston Workers' Circle Center for Jewish Culture and Social Justice and the Islamic Council of New England. These important organizations have provided us the opportunity to gather and discuss a topic essential to our shared future. We also want to thank the co-sponsors who have helped to make this evening's event possible, including my synagogue, Temple Beth Zion in Brookline. Each of these 4 conversations invites us to ask a vital question. First, we asked, can we talk and listen to one another? Then we asked, can we recognize and honor the sanctity of the places in the Holy Land, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims? This week, we gather to discuss our stories as we ask, can we acknowledge the truths within the history and narratives of the other? My name is Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum, and I'm the Rabbi of Congregational Learning and Programming at Temple Beth Zion in Brookline. I grew up here in Brookline and attended Hebrew College for Rabbinical School, where I learned from Christian and Muslim teachers about our shared beliefs, as well as lived in the land of Israel, where I got to hear the stories of Israelis and Palestinians. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear and learn more stories together. I'm so delighted to introduce you to our panelists, Gili Getz, Rabbi Rabbi Cohen, Aziza Hassan, Hedab Tarifi, and Nizar Farsakh. Ayman Najim cannot be with us this evening because of a family emergency, so we send blessings of peace and healing to him and his loved ones. And we're blessed to have Hedab Tarifi at such short notice. Gili Getz is an Israeli-American artist, photojournalist, actor, and activist. He served as a military photographer for the Israeli Army and as a news editor for Ynet. Gili is published regularly in Jewish and Israeli press and by Princeton University in the book Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel by Professor Dov Waxman. Gili has been working for peace and against the occupation for many years and is honored to serve on the board of Combatants for Peace, supporting joint resistance and the struggle for freedom and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians. Aziza Hassan, named an influencer by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, is the executive director of NewGround, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change. She is an experienced mediator and conflict transformation practitioner. She earned the President's Volunteer Service Award in 2006 under President George W. Bush. Aziza served on President Obama's Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. She currently serves on Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's Interfaith Advisory Council. Rabbi Rabbi Cohen, Ph.D., is professor of rabbinic literature in the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the American Jewish University. His latest book is Justice in the City, an argument from the sources of rabbinic Judaism. He's also the rabbi in residence at Bend the Ark, Jewish Action, a national social justice organization. Dr. Cohen is a co-convener of the Black Jewish Justice Alliance, BJJA, and a member of Clergy for Black Lives. Hedab Tarifi was born in Gaza, Palestine. She lived in Kuwait until after the first Gulf War and moved to the US in 1992. She holds a bachelor's degree in computer software engineering from the University of Florida. She's an IT consultant and financial coach. Hedab has been active in the Muslim and interfaith communities in Southern California since 1994. She served and continues to serve on the boards of several interfaith groups and organizations. In 2002, she led the effort to make a quilt in remembrance of 9/11 victims. The quilt now resides in the 9/11 Memorial Museum. In June of 2018, Hedab was honored by the city of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, and Human Relations Commission for her leadership and community contributions to elevate interfaith relations. Hedab works with humanitarian organizations focusing on alleviating the suffering of children in Palestine and the Middle East. And Nizar Farsakh is a board member of Combatants for Peace. He's a trainer, private consultant, and public speaker who focuses his work around leadership, negotiation, and advocacy. He is currently involved in several nonviolent initiatives in Palestine and the US. Nizar holds a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's prepared some comments for later in our discussion. So I will begin the discussion now with some questions and open it up for Q&A. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. So our first question is, what central component of your personal history and narrative has shaped you and your perspective or your position on Israel-Palestine? In addition, what central component of your communal history and narrative has shaped you and your perspective or position? So we'll have about 5 minutes each. Gili, you'll go first.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tiferet. It's really such an honor to be here with all of you, these distinguished speakers that I'm a fan of, and I'm really honored to be here with all of you. I really want to again thank the Boston Workers Circle Center for Jewish Culture and Social Justice and the Islamic Council of New England for creating such a special space of conversation between the Jewish American and Muslim American communities about Israel-Palestine. I want to recognize how rare and precious is the space, a space of deep listening, a space of peace, a space grounded in faith, and for me personally, a sacred space, a holy space. We need more of this as things in the land. If the trends continue, will get harder. This is a very difficult conversation within the American Jewish community, and of course, between the Jewish American and the Muslim American communities, in a very difficult conversation between the Jewish and Palestinian diasporas as well. I'm honored to join and be with you today. I'd like to start by mentioning that today is the anniversary of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in America that happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh 3 years ago, and we mourn today those who were murdered by white supremacists. One of the most profound experiences of my life was going to worship on the first Shabbat after the shooting at Congregation Beth Simchat Torah in New York, and be greeted by members of the Muslim community from the NYU Islamic Center, holding flowers and holding signs in support of the Jewish community and standing guard so we feel safe while we pray. This friendship between the two communities developed after the election of Trump, and members of the CBST started standing outside the Muslim prayer space at NYU's Islamic Center, holding up signs saying, Jewish New Yorkers support our Muslim neighbors, and we are united against hate. That Shabbat, I understood how much our communities really need each other, and as we face uncertain future dealing with white supremacy and the politics of hate. I speak to you today as with Nizar, who I admire, as a member of Combatants for Peace. It's a movement that started by former Israeli and Palestinian combatants who, by taking a real leap of faith, decided to meet each other and talk in secret in the beginning, as it was a taboo in both societies to engage in such conversations. Our activists talk a lot about transformation. It's a central part of this very difficult and challenging work, especially because of the enormous imbalance of power in the land and also here in America. I grew up in Israel to immigrants that arrived from the Soviet Union in the early 70s. Members of my family were murdered by the Nazis and imprisoned by the Soviets. My grandparents escaped in the nick of time, a death sentence. The concern for the safety of my people and my family colors my reality and my experience in the most profound ways. When it was time for me to join the military, I did so proudly. I was there to defend my people. Palestinians are often presented to us not as a distinct people, but that share the land, but part of a hostile Arab world who wanted to remove us from the land, often evoking the wars of 48, 67, 73, and so on. It was during the Oslo peace process, and we Israeli were facing at the time a wave of suicide bombers in restaurants and buses, something that deeply shaped the psyche and sense of safety of every single Israeli and most American Jews. It was my job as a military photographer to document the carnage of these attacks and these horrific scenes. I knew the occupation existed, but I thought it was justified until peace deal was fully negotiated. That is how we keep ourselves safe in a hostile and a volatile region, I told myself. It was only later when I started to understand the complexity and the history and the richness of the Palestinian experience that I came to learn about the daily brutality, violence, and systemic oppression of the occupation, and how I was part of that system that had two different set of laws, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. I learned about the permit regime, the restriction of movement and collective punishment as features of the occupation. I learned about people that are not citizens of any country with no rights. They were living very close to where I grew up, but in entirely different reality. That when I learned that when we Israeli Jews think and talk about safety, we mostly only think about Jewish safety and Jewish trauma, as if it can be decoupled from Palestinian safety and freedom, as if our two stories of Jewish and Palestinian experiences are not deeply intertwined and, in fact, inseparable. Years of anti-occupation activism led me to join the biggest delegation of diaspora Jews with the Center of Jewish Nonviolence to take direct action on the 50th year of the occupation, using our privilege in the land in a coalition with Palestinians and Israelis in Sarura. It's a village in Area C of the West Bank.
Gili, I hate to interrupt you, but we're in the honor of time. You can finish your story a little bit later. We're going to move on to our next panelist. If you want to just wrap up this thought.
Oh, absolutely. I just like to end by saying that my process of transformation was realizing that my experience and the Palestinian experience are deeply, deeply intertwined, as well as our safety and our freedom are deeply intertwined and connected with each other. That's the journey that took many, many, many years, and at the end of it, I ended up being with Combatants for Peace.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Aziza.
I am also deeply grateful to be here with you, and really want to say thank you for convening a special and a very important space, because these spaces are, like Gili said, rare and precious. And the more we can invest in them, that's really what gives me hope in these really difficult times. I am Palestinian. My dad was born in this little tiny town called Khubab. So, or if you say it with a different accent, it's Bab, and it's in the Latrone area, and it's hilly, and you won't see it now. It's completely been erased off the map. There's I went with my siblings in 2005 because we just wanted to see where my dad is from, because I was born in Amman in Jordan, and we wanted to see. And when we went, we saw like carcasses, almost like on stilts, of where the houses, a lot of the houses used to be. There are a couple of things that are still up, like there's maybe a school, something that's still there, but for the most part, it's what you see is sabir plants, which are what you see a lot of Palestinian villages that were literally erased. But a lot of the Arabs or the Palestinians used to love sabir, which is it's like a prickly pear. And you'll see the prickly pears all by these, literally covering the houses in this area. I grew up on these stories that my dad would tell me. And I remember when I was 3 years old, one of my earliest memories is they would be drinking tea at around 7 p.m. And they would say, Aziza, tell us your name. And then I would like stand up as this proud 3-year-old and I'd be like, my name is Aziza Farouk Ali Hasan Ali Hussein Ali Hamad Min al-Qubab. And so that's like my name, my father's name, his father's name, his father's name. You get the idea, and it goes all the way down. And Min al-Qubab is from Qubab. With so much pride. That is who I am. It is where I am from, and I will not forget it. And I just remember these stories of this place. My dad talking about how he was young. He was, I don't know, maybe 4 in 1948, somewhere in there. The details in that regard are fuzzy, but what is clear is that his mom was a young mom and she had a young family, and my grandfather was very civically engaged, and they had all sorts, so lots of kids in this equation. And in 1948, they had to flee because it wasn't safe. They knew that there were both rumors, there had been massacres, there had been my father's cousin, older cousin, had disappeared, and people didn't know where he was. And they needed to leave. And so with these young families, my dad's family left, and they left on foot and just tried to get away and into safety. And in the course of having to leave their home, they left with barely anything, and were on the road with these young kids. And my aunt passed away when they were on this trip, trying to find safety. And eventually they found their place in this another little village called Aryeh. And they all kind of huddled in the home of a Christian man who said, okay, well, actually, I'm leaving to America and you can have the keys to my house. And so he literally, it was concrete, just block. And he gave them the keys, and that's where they stayed. And my dad's mom would literally take old rags and bind his feet with the rags during the winter time because they couldn't afford shoes, and he would walk to school. And then when he would get there, he was punished for being poor. Like one of the teachers is also a Palestinian school. And the teacher was like, you need to have shoes on. And he would be punished because he didn't have shoes on. And so, I mean, there's just layers to poverty and loss. And eventually the family made their way to Jordan. Fast forward, I'm born and raised in Jordan. My mom is actually Midwestern, Caucasian, and Christian. And I remember being in Jordan, and it was my early teens. And I remember hearing about the Hebron Mosque massacre, and just hearing the news and being so taken aback that how is it possible that another human being could walk into a sacred space and kill people and violate life and prayers and sanctity of just what is holy? Like, how is it possible for that to exist? And just really being floored in the most awful ways, like where all these questions were coming into my mind. And that really kind of set me on a path, you know, of what does it mean, like to hate people so much that this could be possible? And I mean, I came to NewGround. I have been building this organization called NewGround, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change. And at NewGround, we hear each other's stories. we honor and we try to give space to each other. And I was hired by a lot of incredible people to come and help build this. And I remember in the early days of building NewGround, I was sitting around a table, and because I believe in bringing people together and being able to wrestle through these hard conversations of, okay, yes, we're in a state of dehumanization, and this is really bad, and there's a lot of work that we have to do, but what does it mean to change the tide? And the risks that we take.
I hate to interrupt you. We're gonna have to move to the next person, so I just want you to give you the chance to finish this thought.
You got it, thank you. It's like, how do you change it? And I remember just sitting around this table, and Rabbi Bierman, may his blessing, his memory be a blessing, talked about being in where my family was from in Khubab in the early 1940s, and about liberation and having this new hope. And it was the first time I'd come across somebody who had been directly connected to why my family had to leave. And in those moments, there are significant pain. There is pain, and there is challenge and risk that we take in being in these moments. And then that moment, I came across, somebody that I currently deeply admire, but it takes a lot of work to be able to see each other, especially when we have been the source of pain for one another.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And look forward to learning more about NewGround later in our program tonight. Rabbi Arya.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Boston Workers Circle and the Islamic Center of New England and everybody who's done all this work to bring us together. I want to echo what Gili said, that this week marks the 3rd anniversary of the killing of 11 Jews in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I also want to mention that this week also marks the 62nd anniversary of the massacre of 40 unarmed Palestinian residents of Kfar Qasim, who were nominally killed because they had violated a curfew which none of them knew about by the Israeli Defense Forces. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s. I was born into a modern Orthodox, which then became more and more Orthodox and very Zionist family. The youth village for child survivors of the Holocaust, Kfar Batya, which was built on lands that had belonged to the Palestinian village Albat Ababsha, was named after a great aunt of mine, Bessie Gottsfeld, who was the president of a large American women's Zionist organization. My mother was always going to this or that meeting of that organization. I moved to Israel in 1976 after high school. It was the custom then for Orthodox high school graduates to spend a year in Israel studying at a yeshiva. After a year, I decided to stay in Israel. I was entranced by the land, by the centuries of Jewish history hidden under the land, by walking in the same space as Abraham and David and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and Rabban Gamliel, rabbis whose words and arguments I studied had lived right down the block, metaphorically speaking. I lived in a world which was shaped by sacred texts and sacred promises. The rebirth of the land of Israel and the rebirth of the Jewish people came hand in hand. I studied Torah and also opened a bank account in the Hebrew, which I now spoke fluently. I was no longer a guest in someone else's land. In truth, I saw much more of what was going on beneath the land and what had happened on the land than who else lived there. I was much more invested in learning the rites of the priests in the temple that would be rebuilt than in Palestinians who shared a reverence for the sacred mountain on which the temple would stand. My perspective started changing in 1982. In April of 1982, Israel completely withdrew from Sinai and completion of the peace deal with Egypt. Then in June of 82, Israel invaded Lebanon, breaking a year-long ceasefire on the pretext of the shooting of the Israeli ambassador in London. Several of my friends were killed in that war in battles with the Syrian army, some of them very close friends. When I got back to my base in Israel, my only thought was, I can't believe people still think this is a good way to solve problems. We Israelis had been lied to by the defense minister about the aims and scope of the war. The siege of Beirut followed, and the massacre in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila carried out by Israel's Maronite Christian allies with support from the IDF. The death of many friends and realization that I had been lied to by the Israeli defense minister the latter being the destruction of one of my central Zionist myths, the purity of Israel's intentions, gave me space to think. I started seeing more than just Jewish history in this beautiful, sacred, sad, forlorn, pitiful land that I was in love with. Something started shifting. I joined a religious Zionist peace organization. I started really hearing the tradition understood in different ways, ways that supported peace. And then I also started seeing Palestinians. Two events stand out for me. I went to a photography exhibit at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The exhibit was of pictures that had been taken on the West Bank by a photographer who had embedded himself with a unit of the Border Patrol. The pictures were shocking. The casual brutality of the soldiers was eye-opening for me. I was shaken to my core. The second event was when I was called up for reserve duty on the West Bank. This was during the First Intifada. Our base was in the Palestinian village of Tekoa, in the schoolhouse. We slept in classrooms. The blackboards had not been erased, and the math lesson that had been up on the last day that the students were in the room was still up on the board. The school bordered on a private house, so whenever I stood guard duty from a post on the roof of the house, I was looking into someone's backyard, into someone's private life. I realized during this tour of duty something essential about the occupation. The evils of occupation were not only, though also, the result of the direct violence of settlers destroying olive trees or soldiers brutalizing unarmed civilians, Palestinian civilians. The occupation was also enacted by everyday reservists without evil intentions who manned a roadblock, and because of a mundane, banal snafu, your replacement didn't come, lunch was late, a phone call, the line of cars waiting to pass would be held up, and the child who had to get to the doctor sat in the car instead. The woman who had to get to work, the man who needed to visit a relative were all held up. People's lives were intruded on by soldiers who had almost unlimited power. And the solution to this was not being nicer. I realized then that the only solution was ending the occupation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hedab.
Greetings of peace, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Tiferet and Shaheen and all the organizers. I appreciate you inviting me. For the longest time, as I engaged in Muslim-Jewish dialogue, I really never talked about my personal story and connection to Palestine, mainly because it was painful to bring all the trauma and the suffering my family and I have faced. I'm not old to witness the Nakba, but I sure lived its aftermath as my father and mother did witness it. My father was 17 when his family escaped Jaffa, for fear of their lives after the Jewish Haganah massacred the Palestinians of the town right in the town center and throughout the streets of Jaffa. By the way, for years, Israel has denied such killing of Palestinians and claimed that Palestinians just left, as if it's natural or normal for a person to wake up one day and decide for no reason that, yeah, I guess it is time to leave my home, my land, and everything, and just go. Not until 2013, when a mass grave containing the remains of about 200 Palestinians was discovered in Jaffa. My father, as I mentioned, was 17, escaping with his family south toward Gaza, becoming a refugee in his own homeland. With that, making me a refugee before I was even born in my own country. Growing up, watching my parents struggle and suffer while overcoming their own pain and stress to give me and my siblings a better chance at a decent life and future. I grew up facing racism and marginalization, being silenced, being discriminated against, and denied my own identity as a Palestinian every step of the way. As a Palestinian carrying a travel document for refugees, I couldn't travel. I couldn't even travel to the country issuing me that travel document. Even when I applied for the US citizenship, I had to fight for the officer to acknowledge that I am Palestinian, as if I am, as a Palestinian, is invisible or a ghost versus being human being. I left Gaza when I was 4 years old. I am 60 now, and all this time I was only allowed to visit my family in Gaza only once. And all my attempts to visit have been denied. I have cousins who my only way of communicating with them is through Facebook and WhatsApp. During assaults on Gaza in the previous years, our daily check-ins always ends with a goodbye, not knowing if we would have any chance the next day to talk. My cousins got married, had children, grandchildren. They lost loved ones. I couldn't be at any of these occasions to celebrate or mourn with them in person. My mother wasn't even allowed to attend her own father and brother as, attend their funeral, since traveling to Gaza was near impossible. Sadly, it is still almost impossible for me. All what I want is to have the opportunity to sit with my cousins freely, watching the sunset on the beach of Gaza, while drinking tea with mint, or perhaps even eating ice cream, my favorite Kazem ice cream, that the taste is still in my mouth since my early childhood in Gaza. How can this be just a wish or a dream? Why? Why am I denied this simple and rightful wish to be a reality? Gaza has been under siege since 2006. The blockade of Gaza is an ongoing land, air, and sea blockade imposed by both Israel and Egypt, causing a humanitarian crisis in this besieged area, a catastrophe to its almost 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza, whether they are native of Gaza or those made refugees in 1948. And now, any Palestinian Israel decide for reason or no reason to expel and exile, they send them, guess where? To Gaza. Gaza is the largest open prison in the world, and Israel is the occupying power. And yet, Israel continues to act and treat the Palestinians in an inhumane, illegal, and sadly, apartheid practices. While I'm talking about Gaza today and raising, awareness about the siege of Gaza, it is important to remember that the issue is Palestine, state of Palestine, not West Bank, not Gaza. Palestinians are hurting and suffering all over the occupied territories. In the West Bank, assassinations continue, home confiscations, demolitions is a daily fact of life for the Palestinians. The mere attempt of living a normal life is going about their daily lives is a struggle by itself. In Gaza, Israel challenged UNRWA on how many calories needed for a Palestinian to survive. And that's how much food supply that Israel would allow going into Gaza. They claim that they allow enough food to enter Gaza to leave Palestinians alive. Guess what? As I said, Gaza is the largest prison, and prisoners are entitled to food and water. And Israel, as an occupying power, has the responsibility to maintain and take care of the people that are in those occupied territories. It is extremely important to remember that the Israeli government, with the support of the United States and with the support of those who are benefiting from the war machine, continue to make Palestinians' lives miserable and almost impossible. It is people like Arya and Gili and others who actually see for themselves the ugliness of the practices of the Israeli government. That gives me hope that we can actually find ways to make people's lives better and perhaps make peace happen. If it's not for people of faith and people of conscience and people of ethics, I certainly have no faith in politicians because one way or the other, they are benefiting. But I have faith.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for starting us off so strong and so honestly. So I have two questions now, one for Rabbi Aryeh, one for Aziza. Rabbi Aryeh, what about the history or the narrative of the Israeli perspective do you believe the Palestinian side finds particularly challenging?
Great question. Remind me how much time I have to answer?
5 minutes, more 5 or 7 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, I don't know if I'll need that. So I think that the basic question is, why did the Jews land on us? I think that it's, yes, Jews have had a long history of oppression, culminating perhaps in the Holocaust, but that oppression was not caused by the Palestinian people. I think it's, and while Jews have carried this history with them from place to place, and it's not only a history of oppression, it's of course a history of thriving in various different places, but eventually being, starting with, when the temple was destroyed, and then the exile from the land of Israel to Babylonia, to Spain, to northern France, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Eastern Europe, and at some point having to move from one place to another, and then finally coming back to the land of their origins. I think that the Palestinians don't have any reason to accept that as, in the same way that the Jews have. And I think that's really hard for the Palestinian population. It would be hard for me, if, that why us? We didn't cause, the Palestinians didn't cause the suffering. Why should the Palestinians necessarily be responsible for the solution? And the second thing is that I think that it's hard for Palestinians, and this I'm not so sure, but I think that, and of course, when I say Palestinians are not a monolith, and there are different communities, there are different Palestinian communities, there are different religions, and there are Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, there are secular Palestinians, there are left-wing Palestinians and right-wing Palestinians. Some of the right-wing Palestinians are sitting in the Israeli government. It's hard to say the Palestinians, but since we're using that language, I'll adopt it. I think it's hard to accept the Jewish claim that the connection with the land of Israel that goes back millennia and did not start in the 20th century. Most of the discourse is around, the 20th century, from the Zionist movement, from the modern political Zionist movement, culminating in the Holocaust as kind of the mic drop for why Jews need whatever language it is, a homeland, a refuge, a place where Jews are safe. But the Jewish claim for connection with the land of Israel goes back millennia. Our texts, our written texts go back to, the 5th, 6th century before the Common Era. Our story goes back even longer. And these texts have been, consistently studied. And I think that's also hard for some Palestinians to accept that kind of a claim. I do want to say, I'm able to get into this in the next question, but I do think that that's all irrelevant. I think that history, that we're not going to solve this on the basis of history. I think that in the present moment, people who are suffering should not suffer, and people who are being persecuted should not be persecuted. I think that the onus is on the Israelis in the current moment. I don't think that the history is where the solution resides. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. I look forward to continuing that thought in the next question. But first, Aziza, I'm going to ask you, what about the history or narrative of the Palestinian perspective do you believe the Israeli side finds particularly challenging?
I really appreciate the question, and I think Hedab actually already touched on this. I think it connects to also the refugee situation. And so I've heard so many times that, and I've facilitated so many conversations where I've heard people say, Palestinians left, they left by choice. And and what I've seen over and over is like, it's something that is clearly deeply personal to me. That's not why my family left. They left because they feared for their lives. But I've heard it enough times, and I've heard it so many different times that the refugee, like, you know, Palestinians could live anywhere. Why do they have to go to this one place? And like what, and I think that it's hard to understand the nuance of why Palestinians have a very distinct identity and a connection to land and place and things. And I think that's something that I especially would see. And then the second part is that when those stories come up, and I don't think this is something that's exclusive to Israelis, I think it's something that's human, is that when Palestinian suffering comes up and that there's this defensive reaction, and I think Palestinians also do the same thing. It's like, well, you need to see my pain too. And instead of actually sitting and listening to the important pain and what is happening and having a space where we truly honor one another, we turn into defensive mode where we're saying, well, what about the forgotten Jews and you hear these stories about the forgotten Jews who fled Arab lands to come to Israel, right? And so those stories are also important, and we can still hold those stories as sacred and make sure that those stories get the light of day. And it's like our pain doesn't have to be at the expense of the other, that we can hold both.
I'd like to add just a quick comment beside what Aziza mentioned. I always find it puzzling that every Jew in the world has a right to come to Palestine, Israel, and immediately gain citizenship. Yet me as a Palestinian who was born in the land, not even able to go and visit, let alone claim the space that my family had owned. I mean, you look at the United Nations declarations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it applies to everybody except the Palestinians. And that's a question that I've always asked. It is critical that we give the Palestinians their rights. So, you know, these rights are universal, and everybody deserves them, and so does the Palestinians.
Thank you for adding that. Nizar, would you like to join in the conversation?
Sure. Actually, I mean, I'm glad Hedab mentioned that. There is a lot that I resonated with, of course, with what's said. And I guess where the thing I would add here is my own experience and transformation has been realizing that it really isn't about Palestinians against Israelis or Arabs against Jews as much as like the line is between those who believe that we as human beings happen to be equal and those who believe that for whatever reason, religious, nationalist, whatever, they somehow have superior rights than others. That's what I found, and that is something I found through my own experience in experiencing the dissonance with the stories I've been told and then the realities I face. So like Aziza, I grew up on my father's stories of Palestine because I was born and raised in Dubai, and he would tell me about those beautiful hills and the olive groves and dancing dabke, which is the folkloric dance. And while we were in Dubai, he always spoke about going back to Palestine, because also while he was in Palestine up to 1967, after 1967 he couldn't go back, and it was always a dream of his and a wish of his to go back, and he always spoke about that, and his friends would say that he's crazy to think so, but ultimately he did manage to go back and with the Oslo process, and then build the house that he promised my mother and what have you. So there is this one of the things that are interesting about and amazing about this place is there is this magic of those who believe despite all the odds. And the final thing I would say there is kind of along also the lines that Rabbi Cohen mentioned, just experiencing the difference between what you've been told and discovering the lies, or just the incomplete realities that were conveyed to you. So when we were in Dubai, we would never say Israel. We would say 1948 Palestine. And we felt so guilty for our brothers and sisters and my cousins who were in Palestine in the first Intifada, paying the price of the struggle. So when we went there in the 90s with the Oslo process, and hearing those same cousins who for us, we put them on a pedestal, they were the ultimate nationalists, they were more Palestinian than any Palestinian, hearing them say Israel. Who am I to tell them, no, you shouldn't call it Israel, you should say 1948 Palestine, right? So that was one of the first encounters for me of realizing that maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe there's something for me to learn. And the other encounters were people like Amira Haas, the famous Jewish Israeli journalist, meeting her in Ramallah, and me wondering, oh my God, how brave of her. She's Jewish Israeli, and she's in the middle of Ramallah, like writing about something, and she's not afraid, and she's actually critical of her country and her tribe in ways I would never dare, criticize my tribe. Or, for example, also the final image that comes to mind is Rabbi Asherman. So for me, I always saw pictures of religious Jews as settlers or people who attack people. The massacre in Hebron was made by a religious Jew who was wearing a kippah. So for me, a kippah means danger, means extremist. And then seeing a picture of a Jewish rabbi picking olives in order to protect Palestinians from, other Israelis who attack Palestinians who are getting the harvest. So those dissonances forced me to see that the divide is really not between Palestinians and Israelis. The divide is between those who not only believe that we are equal, but do something about it. They're not spectators in this sport.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Gili.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi Tiferet. I'd like to add that often the framing for this conversation in my community is that there is a conflict between our two peoples, and everybody has their argument. And I think the blind spot is that it's a conflict between two equal sides, that it's presented as a conflict between two rival narratives or two rival claims to the land. Well, in fact, it's the disparity of power, the imbalance of power is enormous, and it's enormous. As was mentioned, any Jewish person can go to Israel and become a citizen, and Palestinians can't visit. Just to name a few of the imbalances here, not to mention the occupation. It is important for us to always hold, as Nizar so wisely said, that Israelis and Palestinians are a diverse people, and they have diasporas that are also diverse. And that's important for us to always hold. But doing joint work, if not just dialoguing, if we are to build a movement that allows us, despite our historical differences and traumas, to work together for a better future for all people in the Holy Land, the first step we found is to recognize this imbalance of power. It is extremely important that we recognize that very reality. So I think that is a blind spot often in my own community.
Thank you. And we're going to just move on to the next question, and so you can start us with the answering. What are your thoughts on how both peoples can work to better understand and respect the narrative of the other?
So I think there is a difficulty in defining what is in this work. This is something very central, a challenge and an opportunity to define what is a productive dialogue? What is an actual space where we can be fully equal and understand each other's stories and narratives and traumas, to better understand the reality that we experience? And when does it become normalization? When do we just sit and, you tell your story, I'll tell you my story, and when we leave out the door, I'm free and you're not. You are living under a fairly brutal occupation. So when does that dialogue, when does that understanding become normalization? This is a question we struggle with. It's a question that we need to unpack and deal with, and be as precise as we can about what type of conversation is productive and what type of conversation just normalizing a reality that's becoming increasingly more difficult. And, the more I dug into this, despite, working critically against the occupation, what I didn't realize until I went with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence to the West Bank, was that the Nakba for the Palestinian people is not a historical event that now we have to deal with its consequences of refugees and such, but is the reality that's happening right now in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, the neighborhood of East Jerusalem. So how do you construct the dialogue around that conversation? Israelis do not like, I can only speak for my community, Israelis and American Jews don't like really to talk about that, about the occupation, about the reality of it, about the responsibility and so on. It's a topic we avoid. We have that privilege of avoiding talking about the occupation. It's something we in the community as a whole embrace. Palestinians don't have that privilege. And I think that there's a difference there, that these are challenges when we engage in better understanding each other, and better, which is crucial. I mean, there's no bypassing it, but we have to do it carefully. And that's something we think a lot about in the movement.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Aziza, what are your thoughts?
I think it really comes for me down to being with one another, truly being with one another. That includes grace, so that when we are with each other, that we have enough of extra bandwidth that we fully receive each other and take each other in, so that we're not just moving on or just saying my piece and moving on. And that comes to relationship. It's like, what does it mean to really be in relationship with each other, so that we actually genuinely care about each other? At NewGround, we bring together people, not one time, not two times, but like multiple times over a series of months, because if we really want to confront even the ugliness that's within ourselves, we have to be able to be really in relationship, where we can say, this is what's on my mind, and I didn't bring it up earlier, but it's eating at me and I need you to see it. And people staying up late into the night to talk about really important things that we've literally tucked under the rug and said that doesn't exist, and we have to be able to address it. And then I really appreciate what Gili was saying, so just now, specifically, that we have to be able to say, like, there is a point at which the discussion can lend itself to normalization. And my biggest concern, one of the concerns with that, is like, it's not just, it's about being in relationship and genuinely caring enough to figure out what is it that we can do to have compassionate leadership that is willing to do something for the other, willing to be there for each other, side by side, working together and finding a way through. Because it's not enough to just say no to hate. It's actually essential for us to be able to say, I am wrestling with this, I am dedicated to this relationship, and I want to make a difference in your life. And I believe that the status quo isn't acceptable and that we can do something together.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Aryeh.
So in thinking back in my life, how I moved politically and understanding Israel-Palestine, it took a war. And I hope that is not necessary. But I do think that what is necessary is some way to shock ourselves, for people to shock themselves into seeing through the frame that they've been brought up with. So I think that, there are tools out there. I mean, first of all, reading histories, but breaking the silence in getting into the lives of Israeli soldiers who've been in Palestine and things that they've done, and really confronting that. In the same way as what Gili said about Sheikh Jarrah and all the other neighborhoods around Jerusalem, which Israel is trying to with a very specific agenda to colonize and kick out all the Palestinians. To look at the work of Combatants for Peace, look at the work of Trua and rabbis in the States and rabbis for human rights in Israel, and listen to what they're saying. And not be defensive about it. And that was the hardest thing. I remember when I started really thinking about this, it was at a moment in my life when I had left yeshiva, left the army, and was in the university, and I had time to think. And really read about Palestinian history, read about the history from the point of view of Palestinians, read about, I'm just looking over here at my bookshelf, read Rashid Khalidi, read read Tom Segev, read books that are going to challenge your frame of reference. And I think the other question is, I think, the things that Aziza does in NewGround is wonderful, but I think it's also, it comes down to asking ourselves the question, it's not only about, it is about power, but it's also about who is hurting and who is doing the hurting. And I think that that's what has to stop. It has to, the hurting has to stop. The pain has to stop giving pain has to stop.
Thank you. Hedab?
Thank you. I really appreciate what Arya and Gili mentioned. I mean, for them seeing and acknowledging the pain that the Palestinians are going through, and the fact that when in dialogue we're not equal. Truly, I mean, it's a reality. You can't equate the oppressed and the oppressor. And Palestinians have every right to a sovereign state of their own, where they live in peace. And the only way to peace is to really end the complete end to the occupation in all its forms. I hear it a lot from my Palestinian friends, where they say, you know what, just give the Palestinians the right first, and then let's talk about peace. And I can understand that, and I can relate to that, because really, if you're wondering why all these so-called peace talks have failed, it is because the solutions offered were not just. It's not a cliche to say that if there is no justice, there is no peace. That is a reality that we all have to acknowledge, and it is the first card to be put on the table when we're trying to discuss and negotiate peace. On a personal note, I grew up hearing my father telling me about his childhood in Jaffa, where his neighbor to the right, who he used to call uncle, was Christian. And his neighbor to the left, who he used to also call uncle, was a Jew. Had the Jews fleeing the persecution in Europe accepted to live peacefully side by side with the Palestinians, we certainly would not be in the mess we are in right now.
Thank you. Nizar? Nizar, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? No. Apologies for that. I mean, there's very little to add to what's been said. I'm of course very humbled to be in this company. And the one thing that comes to mind is just when we're talking about this and talking about how it's important not only to come together and listen to each other's stories, but to actually take action and be a stand to what we are committed to, right? And not just, again, be spectators to this, is what we often hear over and over again in the media, or it's such a truism that people would say, oh, it's complicated. And it really isn't. It really isn't complicated. There's a lot of trauma in Palestine, Israel. There's a lot of suffering for sure, but it's really not complicated. There's nothing complicated about lack of access to water because somebody's stopping you from accessing water. There is nothing really complicated about hate. There is nothing really complicated about power imbalance. The reality is that, of course, and everybody spoke about that some people have more power than others. And the question is, what do we do about it? So when you hear somebody tell you, oh, it's complicated, know that it's a cop-out. And that it's very irresponsible to say that, because it's just, you know, washing your hands from it and saying, well, it's complicated, there is nothing I can do about it. There is plenty that you can do about it. My personal opinion, and I reserve it to myself, I don't want to impose it on anybody else. I believe, while I am Palestinian and I have my own story of victimhood, I do believe that the Palestinian issue is, Palestine-Israel issue is disproportionately represented in the world compared to the other conflicts in the world. But for better or worse, it does get that attention. And in many ways, of course, again, I'm partial because I'm Palestinian. There's something to be learned there. It's such an intense conflict. You see the worst in people and the worst in humanity, and you see the most amazing and the most magnanimous in human nature there. 1 year there is like 5 years somewhere else. So while somebody might feel distant or not connected to the conflict, in fact, and as we saw also in the experience of the war on terror, quote unquote, how the conflict reverberates across the globe. So I would invite anybody who's listening to this to see the conflict and to ask themselves, what is my piece in this mess? I think that's a question that behooves all of us to ask ourselves, because the suffering has been going for too long, and it's a conflict that's created by humans and can be solved only by humans. It's not a natural catastrophe.
Thank you so much, Nizar. Yeah, what is my piece? What is my place? I'll introduce our next question, which is, how can we continue learning? How can we get involved? And how can we really make a difference? And for me, when I lived in Israel, Palestine, I knew that I needed to see and understand with my own eyes. So I went on Breaking the Silence trip that Rabbi Arya was talking about to Hebron. And Breaking the Silence is an organization of Israeli Defense Force veterans who aim to expose the public to the daily reality of the occupation and Israeli military rule over the Palestinian civilian population in the territories, a reality that these veterans witnessed firsthand during their military service. So they took us on a tour, and it was so powerful to see the desolation, especially in Hebron, and to feel the pain and the sadness, and still be able to see the holiness in that space. It really left me transformed. So, for me, if we could go to the land and to meet face to face in Israel, Palestine, and hear those stories, that is certainly one way to continue the learning. Nizar, did you want to share your ideas about how we can continue the learning, get involved, and make a difference?
Excuse me, you cut out at the end there. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Yes. The question is, how can we continue learning? How can we get involved, and how can we really make a difference?
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah. So from where we just ended, it is asking the question of what is my piece in this mess? How do we ask and inquisitively about what's happening, what's our contribution. My personal advice, and many people agree with me, visiting makes all the difference. Seeing is believing for anybody, Jew, Muslim, Christian, Palestinian, non-denominational, whatever. I've had people who were very strong Palestinian supporters from California, who come from families that supported Palestinians for decades. And they told me, until we physically went there and crossed a checkpoint and were around the wall, we really didn't know what we were talking about, right? And also about what Gili and Rabbi Cohen mentioned is understanding the diversity and the beauty of that place, and that it's not a monolith. It's not just two people fighting. It's much richer and much more beautiful than that, in fact. And that's, in that complexity lies the hope. So if you can visit, definitely visit. If you cannot visit, meet Palestinians and Israelis, meet pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis. Ask them, why do they support Israel? Why do they support Palestine when they're not Palestinian or they're not Israeli or Jewish, right? Try to get to their stories, not the political points, not the slogans, not the abstract ideas and the posturing. Ask them about choices in their life that they made. What is important to them? What's their family story? That's when you get to the real crux of why that place is so special. So organizations like Combatants for Peace or Kids for Peace or others, when you see those organizations that despite all the trauma, because I had a psychologist friend of mine, psychiatrist, and he was saying how it's a mistake to say that Palestinians and Israelis have PTSD. It is TSD, it's actual trauma that is continuous, right? So we need to appreciate that they're traumatized and continually traumatized populations, and yet it's testament to the human condition of the fact that these traumatized people still have the heart and the magnanimity to reach out and ask the question, what can we do to make the situation better? What can we do to move in the right direction? So it behooves us, the people who are not suffering, the people who are not, whose hands are not in the fire, to look for ways to help. And this is where we as Americans, I believe we have, let's say, a special role that we can play, because we're far enough not to, be under those very difficult circumstances, to have some perspective, but also care enough to be able to tell our friends and relatives and loved ones there what they need to hear, not necessarily what they want to hear. To do the real leadership work of asking those difficult questions that people are not asking themselves. And here I will end with this. There is a very good Middle East expert called Ian Listick. He's an academic. He's, I believe, from Pennsylvania, from Penn State, if I'm not mistaken. And he has a very good question. And he's Jewish American. And he says every time he visits Israel, he goes and speaks with right-wing Israelis, both religious and nationalist right-wing Israelis. And he asks them this question: can you see a future for Israel that is both desirable and possible? And I think, and the same applies to Palestinians, right? I ask my friends from Hamas or other groups, okay, if you believe the only solution is to get rid of the Jews and kick them out of there, and they have to live under our state, under our conditions, how do you want to do that? But also, at the end of that, what kind of Palestine is that does unto the Jews, unto the Israelis, what has been done to us Palestinians? How are we better than the Zionists if we end up becoming the new Zionists, right? So these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves, so that we become much more up to the responsibility that people like Combatants for Peace challenge us with.
Thank you. Yes, speaking of Combatants for Peace, Rabbi Arya.
Thank you. I am a combatant. I am for peace, but I'm only recently part of Combatants for Peace, an organization that I really, really admire. But I wanted to actually make a slightly different point, which is speaking to the American Jewish community. To the American Jewish community, we have to start taking responsibility for the occupation, for the continuation of Palestinian suffering. And I think that parents who have kids in day schools and kids who go to summer camp, they have to be very aware of what their kids are being taught. And if they're being taught just one narrative, if they're not being taught a dual narrative about Israel-Palestine, if the green line doesn't exist on the maps in their kids' classes, if they're being taught just Israeli propaganda in order to prepare them for college, they have to get up, stand up and say, no, we want our kids to actually have a legitimate education about about what's going on in that country, because we feel a responsibility towards it. And I think that that's really an important, way of moving forward. If we want to, as Nizar said so rightly, if we want to stand up and do something rather than just sit on the side, we have to get involved in that. There's lots of educational materials, lots of stuff to do, but it takes that first, and at first it's lonely. It takes that first step to get up and say, why are you teaching this? Why are you not asking the question, what's the other side? Right? Who is on the other side? What is their story? How can we hear their story? How can we stop the most amount of pain and suffering that we can stop? And I think that kind of an education will do a lot to bring an end to the occupation, bring about a situation which Israelis and Palestinians can live in with some kind of equity and equality eventually.
Thank you. Hedab.
Thank you. I mean, as a Palestinian, seeing the suffering of my people, there are urgent needs, of course, to support and do humanitarian work. I support a lot of Palestinian organizations that do work on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank. There are several ones, Kinder USA, Palestine Foundation, Mecca for Peace, Anira, and others, and there are almost organizations that Palestinians who feel the pain of their people that they're trying to organize and see how they can send help. But I would like to focus on a different angle, for hope to be there for making a difference and changing not just the narrative, but changing the realities on the ground. Because everything else that has been happening for how many years, it was just a Band-Aid that it peels off and nothing happened. I think we really need to look at the root cause. And the root cause is the fact that Israel governments, they really don't care. They feel empowered that they can do whatever they want, and they're 100% and blindly supported by the United States, where the Israeli can do anything and get away with it. And that's where we need to focus. And this is a privilege for us being here as US citizens, whether they're Muslims, Jews, Christians. I'll just give you an example. Last week, Israel declared 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, only because they fear their findings, they fear their work. And this is not a new practice. Israel has in the past denied the Human Rights Watch access, denied them their findings, rejected their findings, and even denied to give them entry. Israel basically denies entry to anyone who dares to criticize Israel or expose its human rights violations against Palestinians. And unless the United States starts holding Israel accountable and stop this blind support and demand that they adhere to the international law, Israel will continue on its path of destruction. There are many organizations here in the United States, Muslims and Jewish organizations, who actually are on the ground trying to change that and reach out to representatives on Capitol Hill and to educate them. I mean, all these trips that go to Israel, yet trips that were organized to go to Palestine, where Israel denies them even entry. So I encourage all of you to find an organization of those who actually are supporting this kind of work to bring peace. I personally, there's one organization that I'd like to mention. It's called If Not Now. And I was introduced to this organization by an Israeli soldier. He's no longer a soldier at the Israeli army, because he saw with his own eyes and he rejected their practices against the Palestinians. And their work is to educate the Jews and educate the masses about those inhuman practices that Israel does, and try to change policies in DC. If we do not change policies and don't change how the United States look at the issue, because certainly the United States have not been a neutral partner in those peace talks, where we have to change that. We have to change the needle in DC for us to even have any hope of peace. I definitely appreciate people like Gili and Arya, and I work with them in a heartbeat, because I appreciate their ethics and how they stand for what is right and what is just, and they are true to their own faith. I always wonder, the Jews who are hateful and who are calling for the annihilation and the killing and the destruction of Palestinians, how can they actually read the Torah and feel that they are true Jews? So people who are true to their faith and true to their values and true to the ethics of their religion, and standing up for all human as equal, those are the ones who I am willing and I'm extending my hand to work with at any time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna move us along to the Q&A section right now. And I'm gonna ask, there are 3 questions that I'm gonna ask. Hopefully we can get to all of them. And then Nizar, I'll come back for your response, but I wanna read the questions so that our panelists have a chance to think about them. The first question is for Rabbi Cohen. Your book, Justice in the City, makes a powerful statement about living in community together and social justice, and introduces the term, quote, community of obligation. How can this be applied to the Israelis and Palestinians situation? And what role can the American Jewish community play? For Nizar, please share your thoughts on the Palestinian Nakba and how it can be better understood by a wider audience. And lastly, for everyone, hopefully we'll have a chance to say a moment, or whoever feels most called. Can you address the question of the right of return for Palestinians and why Israelis see it as a threat? So Nizar, if you wouldn't mind starting off our Q&A session, please.
Sure. Is the right of return question also to me?
It can be.
Sure. So on the Nakba, so as Hedab and also Aziza mentioned, while the Holocaust and Nakba are 2 different events and they should not be compared, that does not make it any less central to the experience of the Palestinians. And as Gili said, like for Palestinians, the Nakba is a continuous process. It's the dispossession of Palestinians, basically. And it was a catastrophe. The word Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe, because back in 1948, it was so inconceivable that so much could happen, that so many people could be uprooted and a whole space would be cleansed with such efficacy or efficiency, that really the Palestinians and the Arabs in general did not know what just hit them. And in fact, because of the 1948 war and the dismal performance of the Arab regimes and the Arab armies, you had so many coups d'etats and revolutions in Arab countries, like the revolution in Egypt and what happened in Syria and then in Jordan, right? All of that is just the consequence, and even Iraq was a consequence of the shock of 1948. So you cannot really underestimate the impact of that event. Now, in addition to that, if you want to understand what it's about, it's also about the scattering and the fragmentation of Palestinian society. people were living in houses and in cities and in villages, and they had these connections, and they were part of tribes, and all of that got shattered with people, half the population ending in diaspora and the other half being internally displaced. So you had the mayor of a town that suddenly found themselves in a refugee camp in Syria with nothing, and somebody who was a peddler in that town is now somehow much more influential and much more strong in this refugee camp just because of how the chips fell. That scattering required a very strong nationalist narrative to just pull us together. So for us, the Nakba is also, in a sense, a triumph in that we still exist. We did not get extinguished. We continue to exist. And the myth that was propagated by some Zionists saying the old will die and the young would forget continues to be not true, that the Palestinian issue continues to be alive. So that's, if you want to understand the Nakba, talk to Palestinians about their stories. We just opened, 3 years ago actually, we have the anniversary in a few weeks, the Museum of the Palestinian People here in Washington, DC. And there's one in Connecticut, and there's one also in California, in San Diego, I believe. It's in the Palestine Home. My point is, engage those narratives. Listen, you don't need to agree with the history. Don't ask people about their historical points. Ask them about their family, their grandmother, great-grandfather. What kind of fights did they have about why they left, for example, right? So that you get to the story of what Nakba means. Now, on the right,
I think let's just move to Rabbi Cohen for a moment, just so we have a chance to hear that, because we are running short on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I was supposed to be thinking about my answer, but I was listening to the fascinating things that Nizar was saying. But so I would say the central moment in my book, and of course, thank you so much for mentioning my book. That was unpaid advertising. The central moment in my book is the notion of accompaniment. And my book was written specifically about cities, because cities is kind of a much more enclosed and finite area, and even politically for various ways, even megalopolises. But the notion of accompaniment is about arguing that our boundaries of responsibility exceed the geographic boundaries, and that our responsibility to others, especially others who are marginalized or who usually fly below the radar, is a central notion of living together. And I think if we apply the concept of accompaniment to Israel-Palestine, it means that setting up a wall between Israel and the West Bank, in order to be able to, and the effect of that is that, Ramallah, which is 15, 20 minutes from Jerusalem, as the crow flies, depending on how fast the crow flies, but it makes that trip almost impossible. And what the effect of that is that Israeli Jews don't see the occupation. But the notion of accompaniments demands that the boundaries of our responsibility exceed our geographic boundaries, and that we do have responsibility for those who are on the other side of the wall. We do have responsibility for those who are beyond our specific block, neighborhood, city, and even our country. And I think that if that became a governing principle in dealings between Israelis and Palestinians, both internally, in the sense that in Lod, Ramla, Akko, Haifa, and Jerusalem, that the city governments would see not only Jews but also Palestinians as worthy of full humanity, and therefore having worthy of the resources of the state, and also then beyond the boundaries of the state of Israel, beyond the separation wall, whatever we want to call it, then that would bring us closer to a position of living in mutuality.
Thank you so much. Well, it looks like we're at the end of our time, unfortunately, which is so both wonderful and sad. It was wonderful to have such a rich conversation tonight and to hear all of these stories and differing perspectives. I am grateful for the opportunity to have been able to moderate this panel and to learn from all of you and to learn from the questions that you've also submitted. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and for hearing the thoughts of our, like I said, our esteemed speakers, and for all of us just being able to open our hearts and our minds to hearing different perspectives. This is not easy work. We want to thank our presenters and co-sponsors for making this possible. Thank you so much. And lastly, we want to acknowledge that we came together from our different religions, cultures, and life experiences. And we may find ourselves in similar and different places at the end of this. For some of you, what you heard may leave you feeling uncomfortable, and you may have more questions than answers, while others may leave this evening feeling more hopeful. We encourage you to continue to process all of this and to have conversations with family, with friends and colleagues. And it's not too late to register for the last session, and bring a friend. As we leave each other's company, let us remember the commitment that brought us here, to be part of creating a more peaceful and a more just present and future for Israelis and Palestinians. And please take a moment now to complete the online survey. Thank you so much.